On June 14th, 2017, I was guiding a small group through the Tatra Mountains, moving along a route I knew well enough to relax into the rhythm of each step. The day had begun clear, the kind of early summer morning that pulls people into the high trails, even if they have no real reason to be there. By the time we reached Kaspery Wirch, the light was still clean and sharp, and the usual lines of hikers were thinning out. Most people wanted the summit photos, the cable car ride, and an easy descent. My group had something different in mind. They had trained for this distance and this pace, and they trusted the plan I had set. I remember feeling quietly proud of that trust. We began our descent around 6 in the evening, later than I usually preferred, but the sky still looked steady enough. The route stretched ahead in soft bands of gray and ochre rock, the edges brushed with late light. The air smelled of cold stone and pine sap, that clean, thin smell that only appears in the evening at elevation. As we moved down from the crest, the wind shifted, and I felt the temperature drop in that sudden mountain way. One gust, then another, and the warmth was gone. Not far down the trail, we passed an old avalanche warning sign. Its metal was darkened from years of storms, the corners bent from snow loads. Someone had scratched a name into it. Merrick, March 2nd, 1998. The numbers were faint, but readable if you paused and tilted your head slightly. I slowed only long enough to notice it. Names etched into signs weren't unusual. People sometimes marked memorials where they'd lost a friend or relative. I kept walking, letting the group settle into their own pace behind me. One of the older Polish hikers, a man with a calm face and a steady stride, looked at the sign longer than the others. I heard him mutter something under his breath, short and resigned. The tone stuck with me more than the words. His expression shifted into something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't casual either. When I asked if he was all right, he nodded and kept walking without adding anything. I decided not to push him about it. People carried their own stories into the mountains. I'd learned long ago that not all of them were meant to be shared. For the next hour, the trail wound along an exposed slope. The light began to thin in a way that didn't feel tied to the time of day. Storms developed quickly in the Tatras, often sliding down from the peaks with little warning. The sky on the Slovakian side darkened first, a heavy bruise of cloud thickening against the ridgeline. By the time we reached a small junction where a narrow spur branched off, the wind had picked up hard enough that I could feel the trail dust stinging my ankles. I checked my map, then my memory. The right turn should have led us toward safer ground, but in the dimming light, the angles looked slightly off. I hesitated long enough for the group to gather behind me. We took the left spur, thinking it skirted the ridge, and rejoined the main trail farther down. At first it felt correct. The ground sloped in a familiar pattern. The boundary rocks were spaced like the ones I remembered, but within minutes something felt wrong. The terrain under our boots shifted from compact gravel to looser, eroded stone that shifted unpredictably. The slope grew steeper than it should have, and when I looked downslope, the drop curved into a chute that I didn't recognize. The storm clouds thickened overhead, turning the trail into a band of dull, metallic gray. The wind came in strong bursts now, funneling through the gullies with a low, unbroken hum. I felt the uneasy prickling that guides get when something about the route refuses to settle into place. I slowed the group and signaled everyone to bunch closer together, using hand gestures rather than words in the wind. As we edged along the eroded traverse, I kept scanning the terrain for a safer line. The hillside above us was a tangle of loose scree and patches of old snow, hardened into a granular crust. The sound of shifting stone echoed strangely, as if the mountain was hollow in spots. I focused on the placement of each footstep. Then above the wind, a shout cut through. It was sharp, angled, like someone calling directly toward us from upslope. At first I thought it might be one of the group, but the voice carried in a way that didn't match any of them. It sounded close, yet not close enough to be beside me. The pronunciation of my name was off, shaped by an accent that wasn't local. I turned my headlamp toward the upper slope. For a split second, the beam landed on the outline of a man standing on a higher, flatter section of the path, exactly where the safer spur should have been. He wore a faded red jacket, the kind popular decades earlier. The color was washed out, almost pink in the beam's edge. The figure was braced against the wind, one arm raised in what looked like a firm, deliberate motion. I reacted without pausing to think. I gestured sharply to the group, pointing upslope toward the higher line. I felt the urgency rise through my chest as the wind pushed harder. The traverse beneath our feet continued to shed small stones, each movement sounding like the beginning of something larger. I moved first, angling toward the upper slope, checking every foothold. The group followed, tense and careful. When we reached the flatter ground, I looked for the man. The headlamp beam swept across the rocks, but no one stood there. The space held only a rusted metal pole jutting from the ground at an awkward angle. It looked like an old trail marker that had lost its sign at some point, leaving only the bare support. A crust of lichen covered most of its surface, giving it a mottled green-gray appearance. The group gathered beside me, catching their breath. The older Polish hiker stepped close to the pole. He leaned in, brushing away a thin patch of lichen with the sleeve of his jacket. Underneath, faint letters emerged, worn but still visible. The same name we'd seen earlier. The same date. The scratched lines looked old enough to match the age of the pole itself, not something added recently. I felt a slow, grounding clarity settle over me. Mountain environments distort sound in ways that can confuse even experienced guides. Wind pushes voices across ridges. Light refracts strangely in storm conditions. A person can mistake a stump or an old marker pole for a figure when the light is low and the urgency is high. I knew all of this in a practical, professional sense. Still, the sequence of events sat heavily with me. The older hiker finally spoke in a low tone, shaped more by memory than by certainty. He said that a man named Marek had died on that slope nearly 20 years earlier. He had been part of a small rescue attempt after another group had taken the wrong turn near that same junction. The avalanche that killed him had been triggered by unstable late-afternoon snow during a fast-moving storm, almost exactly at the same hour of day. Over time, hikers had left marks, names scratched into signs, warnings carved into exposed metal. People said they sometimes heard shouting in storms near the traverse, echoes of the accident carried and twisted by the geography. I let the explanation settle in my mind. It felt consistent with everything I knew about the way mountains held onto sound and memory, how tragedies embedded themselves in the landscape in ways that were more psychological than anything else. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible, just human stories and the environment repeating them under the right conditions. We stayed on the safer path until the storm passed enough for the light to strengthen again. The remainder of the descent was slow, controlled, and methodical. Every step felt more deliberate than before. When we finally reached the lower station, the clouds were beginning to break, and the first hints of blue emerged through the thinning gray. Later that night, after the group dispersed and I was left alone with the quiet hum of the lodge heater, I thought again about the moment on the slope. What stayed with me wasn't the shape I thought I saw, nor the voice that carried through the wind. It was the realization of how easily a guide, even one who trusted his senses, could be influenced by a mix of weather, tension, and the trace impressions of a place marked by older events. The mountains preserved every incident in their own way, and the mind filled in what the eye could not quite make out. By the next morning, the trail reports confirmed what I already understood. The junction markers in that area were overdue for replacement, and the old spur we had taken was now officially considered unsafe due to erosion. The rusted pole we had found was once part of the original sign system before newer ones were installed. No one had been on that higher path at the time we were there. No sightings, no hikers in red jackets, no rescues reported. Only us, the storm, and the landscape echoing its own history. The story of Marek was real enough. The older hiker's recollection matched archived reports I later looked up. But everything else, what I thought I saw, what I thought I heard, fit neatly into the long list of experiences guides have when pressure and environment blend at the worst possible moment. That realization, rather than fear, was what settled deepest in me. Mountains don't need anything supernatural to unsettle you. They hold light and sound in ways that bend your certainty. They let old events sit close to the surface, waiting for the right conditions to rise again. What happened that evening was a reminder of how thin the line can be between perception and reality, especially when the stakes are high. I never dismissed the experience, but I understood it. And in the years since, when I pass any weather-beaten marker scratched with a name, I feel the same quiet respect. Not for ghosts or legends, but for the way a place remembers what happens on it, and for how easily we can mistake that memory for something else when the wind changes and the light runs out. Late September 2015 felt colder than I expected for that part of the Carpathians. Even before the sun went down, the air on the ridge above Funda Moldove carried the kind of chill that sank through my jacket if I stood still too long. Our team had been working the same set of transects for days, hiking the same narrow trails at dawn and dusk until they blurred together. The work wasn't difficult, just repetitive, checking for scat, tracks, hair caught on bark, the usual signs that bears and wolves still cross those slopes. Most evenings passed quietly, the forest going dim around us, as if someone kept turning a knob on the light. That evening I had fallen behind, partly because one of the camera traps had stopped working the night before, and I wanted to reposition it, partly because I liked the solitude that came when the others headed down early. The ridge felt open in a way the lower trails didn't. The pines were spaced just far enough apart to let in thin stripes of fading light, and from the high point I could see the clay-red roofs of the village scattered in the valley. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. Dogs barked somewhere far off, too faint to carry any urgency. At around 7:30, the rest of my team decided to start back while there was still enough light to pick out the switchbacks. They had been talking all afternoon about wanting to beat the cold front that was supposed to roll in overnight. I told them I just needed 20 more minutes to finish the last line of camera traps. They didn't argue, they knew I worked faster when alone. After they disappeared down the first bend, their footsteps faded fast, replaced by the sound of wind sliding through the needles overhead. I liked that kind of quiet, steady, predictable, almost like the mountain was breathing. I moved along the ridge toward the last tree on my list, kneeling to adjust the strap on the camera and brushing fallen needles off the sensor. The light had thinned to a pale blue by then, the kind that made every rock and stump look like it had a shadow, even when it didn't. I worked with the small headlamp on its lowest setting to preserve the battery. The cold became more noticeable once I stopped moving. Every few breaths, I could see my breath drift upward like mist. I had just finished packing the small toolkit when I heard the first crack of a branch somewhere up the slope behind me. It wasn't loud, but it was decisive, the kind of sound that made my mind jump automatically to bear. I froze for a moment, listening. Another crack followed, about 3 seconds after the first. Then another, same spacing, same weight behind it. I'd heard bears move through undergrowth before, and their steps didn't fall with that kind of rhythm. They shifted their weight unevenly, pausing, testing, pushing through brush in a way that sounded almost deliberate. These steps felt too measured, like whoever or whatever was moving had decided on a pace and stuck to it. I reached for the flare in my vest mostly out of habit. We carried them for emergencies, though we rarely used them. I didn't pull it out yet. I just rested my hand on it and listened. The steps kept coming, slow but steady, continuing a few beats longer before stopping altogether, as if whoever was moving had realized I'd noticed. The slope above me was steep but walkable. It was covered in thick pines and scattered boulders, plenty of cover for a large animal or a person. I swept my flashlight across the trees, but the beam got eaten by the darkness almost instantly. The trunks stood like black pillars, the ground between them a tangle of fallen needles, roots, and patches of rock. Nothing moved. I could feel my heartbeat rising, not from panic, but from the sense that something about the situation didn't fit. I knew my team had gone downhill, not uphill. There was no reason for anyone else to be on that ridge at that hour. The locals usually avoided the forest after dark, and the nearest house was far below. The temperature dipped sharply as the last of the light slipped behind the ridge. My fingers felt stiff against the strap of my pack. I took a slow step backward toward the trail, making as little noise as possible. The air seemed to press in around me, every sound amplified by the growing dark. Then a voice came from up the slope. It used accented English, clear but almost casual, saying only that I was late. For a second, the words didn't register. I was too focused on placing the voice, on trying to figure out how far it was, whether it carried the way normal voices did. It seemed to come from between two pines about 20 meters uphill, though I couldn't see anything there. My mind raced through explanations. A shepherd? A villager? Someone from another research team? But no one should have known I stayed behind. Our radios had been off all day to save battery, and we hadn't met another person on the ridge. I brought my flashlight back to the same patch of trees, but again the beam revealed nothing. I stood there long enough for my breath to pulse in and out of the narrow light from my headlamp. My skin prickled under my jacket. I tried to steady my thoughts, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe sound was bouncing strangely across the slope. Maybe someone had been hiking quietly and heard us working earlier. I kept searching for something that made the moment feel ordinary, but nothing did. When I called out to see if someone needed help, I didn't raise my voice much. The cold had tightened my throat. The answer came so quickly I almost thought it overlapped with my own words. It came from downhill this time, closer, repeating the same phrase with the same calm tone. I turned so fast my boot slipped on a patch of loose needles, sending a thin spray of them downhill. I steadied myself and swung the flashlight toward the lower trail. Again the light met only trees and stones. The forest around me suddenly felt too narrow, as if every trunk could be hiding someone standing completely still. The even spacing of the footsteps from before replayed in my head, sharpening the sense that whoever was out there wasn't stumbling or rushing. They were pacing, almost marking time. My breath turned harsh and too loud in my ears. I gripped the flare without pulling it free, unsure if setting one off would help or trap me in its glow. I took another step toward the trail, planning to move slowly until the ridge opened enough that I could see more than a few meters ahead. Before I could move again, the same voice reached me a third time. It didn't come from uphill or downhill. It came from just beside my left ear, close enough that I felt a puff of warm air brush my cheek. The single word it said was low and direct, not shouted, not strained. Run. Every muscle in my body reacted at once. I lunged toward the trail as if yanked by a rope, stumbling at first, then finding my footing as I forced myself into a full sprint. Branches slapped my arms and scratched my face. My backpack thudded against my shoulders hard enough to throw off my balance, but I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. The trail dropped faster than I remembered, bending sharply around rock outcrops and fallen trees. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but the only sound was my own crashing descent and my breath roaring in my ears. By the time the forest opened into the small clearing where the jeep sat, my legs were shaking and my shirt stuck to my back with cold sweat. The interior light was on, glowing softly through the windows. Two of my teammates stood outside the vehicle. They froze the moment they saw me burst from the trees. Their expressions shifted from confusion to concern in an instant. I could barely form words. I tried to explain that someone had been on the ridge, that the voice had come from impossible directions, that I had run because I felt too exposed to stay. They exchanged a quick look. Our lead stared at me longer than the others, his brow creased, his attention fixed on the cuts on my face. He said something under his breath in Romanian, maybe forgetting for a moment that I understood some of it. He said I had heard it too. The way he said it told me more than he meant to. It was not surprise or doubt. It was recognition, an admission that whatever had happened to me had happened before, perhaps more than once. In the following days, neither he nor the others suggested returning to that ridge in the evening. They reorganized our routes to avoid it entirely. Whenever I asked why, they answered with vague comments about safety or terrain conditions, but none of it matched the tension I saw on their faces when the subject came up. Eventually I pieced together the explanation that made the most sense. Several locals spoke about an older man who used to roam the upper slopes, living alone in a shack somewhere off the marked trails. They said he had a habit of walking at dusk, pacing the forest with almost mechanical rhythm. He had been known to approach hikers without making himself known until he was close, speaking softly, testing their reactions. Some villagers believed he suffered from a cognitive condition that made his behavior unpredictable. According to them, he moved through those woods long after his family thought he had stopped. If he crossed our ridge that evening, he could have easily drifted between the trees without giving himself away in the beam of a flashlight. Sound carried strangely in those forests, bouncing between trunks in a way that made direction hard to judge. A voice could seem to come from anywhere. Once I learned that, the events on the ridge settled into something I could understand. I hadn't encountered anything supernatural. I'd simply been alone, tired, and caught off guard by someone who moved through those forests with a familiarity I didn't have. The even spacing of the footsteps, the voice appearing suddenly from different angles, the warmth at my ear, all of it could be explained by distance, acoustics, and the unpredictable presence of a man who had likely been walking those slopes for decades. I never saw him again, and I never returned to that ridge alone at dusk. But I understood why my teammates avoided it afterward. The forest there wasn't dangerous in any mystical sense. It was dangerous in the ordinary way that real places are, where people, terrain, and fading light combine into something that can overwhelm your sense of control if you're not ready for it. I had been on Mount Hood enough times to know how quickly the weather could change, but that afternoon moved in with a weight that felt strange even before anything went wrong. At 7:10 p.m. on October 3rd, 2021, I was halfway up a loose, scree-covered slope above Timberline Lodge, picking my way down after a short solo climb. The light had faded faster than the forecast suggested, and a soft fog had started to gather in the dips and folds of the mountain. By the time I switched on my headlamp, the beam felt weaker than usual, just a narrow cone swallowed by pale gray air. I kept telling myself I only had to drop a few hundred more feet before the terrain leveled out into a gentler field of packed snow and gravel. I had done that descent in daylight more times than I could count, but now every few steps sent a sheet of loose rock sliding ahead of me. My boots carried the small grit, so it sounded like sand pouring down a metal chute. I tried to follow the faint pattern of my own prints from earlier, darker patches in the scree where I had stepped in the afternoon light, but they blended with dozens of old impressions left by other climbers. Every few yards I had to stop and circle the headlamp beam around my feet, trying to fix the line I had taken before the fog moved in. For a while I was sure I was still on my own route. The slope had that same shallow bend to the left, and the rocks had that dusty, dry texture that usually meant I was still above the lodge-facing side. But then I noticed something that didn't match what my memory told me. The ground ahead of me held a fresh set of prints in the gravel, deeper than most, the kind that came from stiff boots with full weight behind each step. They were recent. The edges were too clean to be more than minutes old. At first I thought they were mine, but the direction was wrong. They were headed up the mountain. I had been moving down. I hadn't seen anyone for hours. The afternoon had been empty, just a couple of distant hikers near the parking area when I left. I knew enough about the mountain to understand how risky it would be for anyone to push higher that late in the day with the fog hiding everything past arm's reach. For a moment I tried to convince myself the prints belonged to someone who had cut across the slope from another direction, but the fog made it impossible to scan for a figure, and the stillness around me pressed in like the inside of a closed room. I crouched to examine the prints more closely, feeling the cold grit under my gloves. They aimed straight up toward a small rise that quickly vanished into the thick gray. The spacing suggested a steady pace, not hurried, not stumbling. Whoever made them moved with purpose. That made me feel worse, because the path they were on led toward terrain I knew dropped off sharply on the far side. No one who knew Mount Hood would walk that way without checking the slope. I dug my GPS device from my pack. The screen glowed weakly in the fog. According to the map, I was about 200 yards off the marked climber's route, pushed too far east without noticing. It didn't take much to drift like that in poor visibility, but it unsettled me how far I had gone before realizing it. I tried to recenter myself by turning west, but the fog made every direction look identical. My headlamp caught nothing but swirling white. When I looked up from the GPS, my stomach clenched. There was a figure standing just at the limit where my light dissolved into the fog. A dark, upright shape, its outline faint but unmistakable. No headlamp, no reflective gear. Too still to be someone adjusting their pack or checking equipment. It stood like a post planted into the slope. I stayed where I was, breathing through the tight feeling in my ribs. The mountain had a way of turning shadows into people and people into shadows, but this shape had clean edges that didn't shift like fog does. I tried to focus on the details. Lightly hunched shoulders, feet angled slightly outward, arms close to the body. Every instinct told me to back down the slope, but the ground behind me was just as unstable as the ground ahead, and I needed to know whether this was another climber who might be in trouble. The shape moved in a slow way that made the hairs rise at the back of my neck. Not toward me, just a turning motion, as though it were pivoting to glance over its shoulder. The tilt of its head changed, and I felt the sensation of being watched even though I couldn't see its face. Then it took a step sideways, toward the right, and disappeared from view. That direction didn't make sense. I knew what lay past that spot, a sheer drop that fell several hundred feet into a gully scattered with boulders. Even in fog, no one would walk that way unless they had lost all sense of where they were. I waited for the sound of stones knocking loose or the scrape of boots on rock, but nothing came. The fog closed in again, erasing the place where the figure had stood. My body reacted before my mind did. I climbed the slope toward the spot, digging my boots into the loose rock, feeling them slide half a foot back with every step. The cold air pressed against my face, and my headlamp beam shook with each scramble. I reached the small rise, breathing hard, and aimed the light downward. The prints I had followed came right up to the edge of the drop. They stopped in a clean line. No smear of gravel from a boot slipping, no drag marks, nothing that suggested hesitation or struggle. Just an abrupt end at the cliff. The fog thinned for a few seconds, enough for me to see the void below. If anything had fallen, there would have been some trace. A rock knocked free. A cloud of dust. A thud carried upward through the cold air. I listened as hard as I could, but the mountain gave me only silence. A strong push of wind wrapped around the ridge, lifting the fog in loose waves. It hit my chest with enough force that I had to brace myself. The gust carried a strange illusion, as if the air itself were nudging me toward the drop. I stepped back quickly, feeling the gravel shift beneath my heels. My first clear thought was that I needed to get off that slope as soon as possible. Everything about the situation was wrong in a physical, logistical way. Wrong enough that it didn't need anything supernatural to terrify me. The figure had either never been human, just a trick formed from fog and fear, or it had been a real person who stepped somewhere they shouldn't have. If it was the latter, there was nothing I could do for them without risking my own fall. If it was the former, then the mountain had managed to exploit a moment when I was already disoriented and unsettled. I forced myself to ignore the prints and focus on the GPS. I recalibrated my direction, angling back toward the west even though the fog made the slope look like a blank sheet. Every few steps my foot slid in the loose rock, sending a soft cascade downhill. My hands were cold enough that I had to flex them to keep feeling in my fingers. The air tasted metallic from the minerals in the dust. The wind rose and fell in uneven breaths. Sometimes it pressed the fog inward so all I could see was the ground at my feet. Sometimes it pushed it apart for a second or two, giving me a glimpse of darker rock farther ahead. Each small opening helped me correct my course. My legs burned from the tension of keeping balanced on the unstable surface. It took longer than I expected to find the edge of the marked route again. The slope suddenly shifted from loose scree to more compact gravel, and I recognized the flatter stretch where I had climbed earlier. Relief hit me in a physical wave. I paused, letting my breathing settle, and looked back. The fog had swallowed the upper slope completely. There was no sign of movement, no suggestion of a figure, no trace that anything unusual had happened except for the lingering unease in my chest. The rest of the descent felt slow but steady. As I dropped lower, the fog thinned enough for the faint glow of the lodge lights to appear through the haze. The ground grew firmer. The sound of shifting rock changed to the more familiar crunch of compacted gravel. By the time I reached the lower path, my muscles were shaking from a mix of exertion and leftover fear. Later, after I reached my car and warmed my hands over the vents, I replayed the moment over and over in my head. The most logical explanation was the simplest one. I had mistaken a pattern in the fog for a person. The prints could have belonged to an earlier climber, and my headlamp's beam might have made them look fresher than they were. My mind had been working under stress, low visibility, and a growing sense of being off-route. The mountain had given me shapes where none existed in silence that felt meaningful only because I was already on edge. The explanation settled me enough to drive home, but even now I can still see that outline whenever I think of the mountain. I can picture the still posture and the slow turn, even though I know the fog can make angles and shadows that look more solid than they are. What lingers with me most isn't the figure itself, but the prints ending at that drop with such clean precision. I tell myself it was the angle of the light or the way the gravel shifted after I approached. I know what I saw. I also know how easily the mountain can distort everything you rely on to stay oriented. The mind tries to fill in missing pieces when the world turns featureless around you. That night, the fog kept just enough of the truth hidden to make the rest of it feel real. And that was enough to stay with me long after the mountain disappeared behind me in the rearview mirror. I was already uneasy when we started up the approach that morning, long before anything strange happened. The east face of Long's Peak has a way of showing you how small and temporary you are. Even in July, the air has a cold bite, and the walls rise in these huge, quiet slabs that seem to mute every sound. My friend kept a steady pace, but I felt heavy, like I could sense the altitude in my teeth. We had gotten a late start because of traffic on the road, and I remember checking my watch at the trailhead and thinking we were cutting things too close. The weather forecast was clear and the sky looked clean enough, so we shrugged it off. But there's a certain tension that lurks in the back of your mind when you know you're already giving the mountain an advantage. By the time we reached Broadway Ledge, the sun was just beginning to angle west. The light had shifted from white to that deeper yellow that makes the granite look almost warm, even though it felt colder by the minute. I could feel the temperature drop as a soft wind threaded through the couloir. I tried to shake off the feeling that we should hurry, but the ledge sits above a huge void, and something about the scale of it always slows me down whether I want it to or not. The exposure is so total that it feels like standing above the open mouth of the world. We set up the rappel anchor on a block that thousands of climbers had used before, a thick sling looped around a chalkstone. It looked solid, but I still tested it twice, then again just because my hands didn't trust my eyes. My friend clipped in first. His movements were calm, but I could see how stiff his shoulders were. He didn't say anything about the light or the time, but we both knew we were pushing it. He leaned back over the edge, shifted his weight into the rope, and vanished slowly, inch by inch, until only the line sliding through the device told me he was still descending. As soon as he was out of sight, the quiet hit in an almost physical way. It was the kind of silence where the only sounds are the ones your mind wants to invent. The wind brushed across the wall with an uneven rhythm, and for a moment I thought I heard something else layered under it. A faint pressure built behind my ears, like someone was standing too close. I kept glancing over my shoulder, even though there was nothing but rock. My breathing grew shallow in the cold air, and the back of my neck prickled as if a shadow had passed over me. I blamed the elevation at first. Fatigue can play tricks on you when you're above 13,000 feet. I focused on the rope, wanting something real to ground myself with, but then I noticed the movement. The rope twitched in my hands, not with the long, predictable pull of someone descending, but with these short, abrupt jerks. They felt wrong, too sharp, like someone was yanking the line 3 or 4 feet below me. I crouched lower to steady myself, expecting to see dust or small stones knocked loose by my partner's boots. Nothing moved below. The wall stayed still. I waited for a pattern that never came. The rope quivered again, then went slack, then snapped tight once more. I tried to convince myself my friend had hit some awkward section and was adjusting his stance, maybe bouncing lightly to get around a bulge. But these movements were too violent, like someone was trying to unsettle me. The idea made my palms sweat inside my gloves. The wind picked up again, sweeping down the couloir in sudden, uneven bursts that made small pebbles skitter across the ledge. As the gust eased, another sound rose, thin and quick. It wasn't ours. It had the slap of rope hitting rock, but from a slightly different angle, too close, too distinct. I turned my head just enough to place it without shifting my feet. To my right, somewhere along the wall, I heard the sharp ring of metal tapping stone. The sound was light but unmistakable, the kind a carabiner makes when it swings and bumps against something. It was followed by the low creak of a harness shifting under weight. The air felt thick in my throat as I let my eyes move only as far as they could in the corner of my vision. I didn't want to look directly, not yet. Something dark hung a few feet out from the wall, legs in loose-fitting climbing pants, boots pointed straight down, barely swaying. They hung at an angle that suggested someone was suspended in space, motionless except for a slow, unnatural drift. For one long second, I watched the boots hover there, toes perfectly vertical, as if the person wasn't putting any pressure on the rope at all. My chest tightened in a way that felt like a fist was pressing into it. I forced myself to turn my head fully, trying to confirm what I'd seen, and the moment I did, the figure was gone. Nothing remained but a length of old rope wedged in a crack a little to my right, its fibers bleached almost white by years of sun. The end was frayed like it had snapped under load at some point long ago. The rope whipped in the rising wind, making that same quick slapping sound I had heard. My skin crawled with the cold realization that everything I'd sensed, the gear sounds, the weight shifting, the presence, had been built from nothing more than stray noise and shadows. I stared at the old rope until my vision blurred slightly. I tried to tell myself I had only imagined the legs, that my nerves had taken the flapping rope and turned it into something human because my mind was already on edge. The altitude, the fading light, the long day, they can stitch illusions together if you give them enough raw material. But it didn't stop the tightness spreading down my spine. My hands trembled as I fed more slack through my device, waiting for the line to go fully loose so I would know my friend was off. When the rope finally lost tension, I felt it in a sudden drop in my stance. I steadied myself and began the process of clipping in for my own descent. My movements felt clumsy, like my fingers had thickened. The wind blew again, carrying dust that stung my cheek. I tried not to think about the twitching earlier, but the thought stayed with me. If I had pulled while he was descending, even by accident, it could have sent him swinging into the wall or off balance. That fear hollowed out my chest even more. Once I started down, the rappel felt longer than it should have. The face stretched below me in a pale, featureless sweep, and the shadows from the ridge thickened in the couloir. Every shift of the rope above made me flinch. I kept seeing that sun-faded length of rope in my mind, its frayed end fluttering like a torn nerve. About halfway down, a loose stone clattered far below, echoing up the wall in a way that made my stomach twist. I forced myself to keep moving. When I reached my friend, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the rope still vibrating slightly between my hands. His face had gone pale, and even in the growing darkness, I could see tension etched across his jaw. He told me he had felt the rope bouncing in hard, uneven jerks while he descended, as if someone above him was yanking on it with force. He said it had thrown him off balance twice, enough that he'd had to brace himself against the wall. He thought I had done it intentionally to rush him or to joke around, and it had scared him senseless until he'd realized the movements didn't match the rhythm of anything he'd ever felt from a partner. I didn't answer him right away. The truth pressed against my ribs in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Those sharp tugs I had felt hadn't been his doing, and the ones he'd felt hadn't been mine. The rope must have run over some unseen edge or snagged briefly on a sharp flake we hadn't noticed, magnifying each shift into something violent. The old rope wedged in the crack must have been catching the wind at just the right angle to make it sound alive. Altitude and fatigue had built the rest. As we hiked down in the fading light, the cold settling deeper into the rock, I couldn't shake the sense that the face had been reminding us how easily simple things can go wrong. A snagged line, a gust of wind, a frayed rope that looked like a shape it wasn't. Everything we'd felt had come from real physical causes, but when your body is tired and the world drops away beneath your feet, those causes twist into something heavier. The mountain doesn't need anything supernatural to unsettle you. It only needs silence, exposure, and a mind stretched thin. By the time we reached the trail again, the last scrap of daylight had vanished. My legs felt rubbery, and my hands still tingled from the tension I had carried in them for so long. I kept thinking of those boots hanging straight down, too still, too perfect in the corner of my eye. I knew now it had been nothing more than the wind catching that old rope in just the right way, making it lean and sway like a silhouette. But even with the explanation clear in my mind, the image stayed with me. It taught me something I hadn't learned on any other climb. Fear doesn't always come from what is actually there. Sometimes it comes from the thin space between what you see and what you think you see, the split second where your mind fills in the gaps with whatever you're trying hardest not to imagine. And once it does, you carry that weight with you, long after the ropes are coiled and the wall is far behind you. In August 2020, I planned a long solo run on the Blue Lakes Trail near Telluride, trying to make the most of the clear weather and the fact that I'd been training for months. I wanted a quiet morning in the mountains, something steady and predictable, the kind of effort where I could find a rhythm and settle into it before the heat built. I parked before sunrise, stepped out into that thin, cold air that always sits in the basins before dawn, and started up the trail with my headlamp cutting a narrow tunnel through the trees. The first mile unfolded the way I expected. Smooth dirt, wide enough to run comfortably, with the silhouettes of firs and spruces forming clean lines against the still dark sky. My breath echoed inside my jacket hood, and each step felt controlled and familiar. I'd run in the dark plenty of times, and nothing about it felt strange. By the time my watch hit 5:45 a.m., the sky above the higher ridges carried a faint pink glow along the edges, that soft shimmer that appears just before full morning touches the valley. I could see without my headlamp, so I switched it off and clipped it to my vest. According to my training app, I should have been nearing the point where the trail eased out of the trees and opened toward the meadows below the lower lake. The elevation profile on the GPX file showed a steady climb followed by gentle terrain, nothing complicated. But the forest around me didn't match what I expected. Instead of thinning, the trees pressed closer together. The air smelled dense with sap and wet moss, heavier than it should have at that elevation. I kept checking for the light between trunks, waiting for a sign the canopy was opening up, but the path just narrowed until it felt more like a game trail than anything intended for foot traffic. I slowed partly because the footing got rougher and partly because something about the geography felt wrong. I'd been following the GPX line carefully, every bend, every switchback, but the trail under my feet seemed sharper, tighter, less worn than the one I remembered from a previous trip. When I lifted my watch to check distance, it showed just over 6 miles. At my usual pace, that meant I should have been well past the tree line and approaching the high meadow. Instead, I was still surrounded by tall, crowded trunks, the air darker than it should have been at that hour. I stopped, letting my breathing settle. The smell of wet earth soaked the air, and the texture of the silence felt thick, as if the trees were absorbing every sound instead of letting it echo. When I pulled out my phone, the map still showed the GPX track, but the little position dot displayed something that made my stomach tighten. Instead of a clean line climbing toward the lakes, it showed a crooked loop, a big, sloppy circle that overlapped itself. According to the device, I had run almost an hour, yet somehow stayed within a mile of the trailhead. I zoomed in and out, trying to make sense of it, telling myself it had to be a GPS drift. Tall trees can cause that sometimes. Steep valleys can too. But the loop was too deliberate, almost tracing the same shape repeatedly, as if I'd been circling without noticing. I stood still for a long moment, listening for any sound that could anchor me. Wind in branches, water runoff, a distant bird, but the forest felt unnervingly quiet. Then I heard something that made a cold ripple run across my skin. It sounded exactly like the rhythm of my own footsteps, the same pace I'd held for most of the morning, a light, steady jog. The sound came from somewhere ahead of me on the narrow trail, the cadence so perfectly familiar that for an instant I thought I was hearing an echo from earlier, some delayed bounce of sound in the valley. But the steps didn't repeat or fade like an echo. They continued for several seconds, moving steadily away, controlled and even like another runner following the same pace. I waited, trying to match the sound to an animal, but the timing and weight of it didn't line up with anything I knew. Deer movement is erratic. Elk are heavier. Smaller animals move too lightly or too fast. These steps had a human consistency, each one landing in almost the same rhythm I used when I settled into my long-distance pace. I felt a tightening in my chest as I listened. My mind reached for explanations, another runner, a hiker, maybe someone camping nearby, but the trail wasn't wide enough for two people to pass easily, and I hadn't seen any cars at the trailhead when I arrived. The instant I made a sound, just the quick exhale of surprise, the footsteps ahead stopped. The silence that followed felt unnatural. Even the distant rustle of high branches went still, as if the whole forest paused at the same time. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing, waiting for some clue that would give the moment a normal explanation. Nothing happened. Then the footsteps started again, but this time they came from behind me, at the exact same tempo and distance they had been ahead. The rhythm matched mine so closely that I recognized small details. How I sometimes land a little heavier on my right foot. How my cadence stays consistent even on uneven terrain. It felt like listening to a recording of myself that someone was playing just out of sight, except the spacing of the impacts suggested movement. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. It was still too dim for long-range visibility, and the density of the trunks made it impossible to see far off the trail. My hands felt cold despite the effort of the run. When I looked down at my phone again, the compass spun once, twice, then reset. The GPX track updated and drew another perfect circle, overlapping the first as if I had just completed another loop while standing still. It didn't make sense, and whatever logic I tried to apply only made the situation feel more off balance. I didn't think beyond the instinct to get out of the trees. I picked a direction, downhill, and forced my way straight through the underbrush, ignoring the branches grabbing at my vest and the roots trying to pull at my shoes. Shrubs scraped across my shins until they stung, and loose rocks skidded under my feet. The slope was steeper than I realized, and several times I had to lean back hard to keep from sliding on the wet ground. My heart pounded against my ribs, faster than any controlled running pace, and I felt the burn in my legs within seconds. The forest resisted every step. Fallen logs blocked my way at angles that made me scramble over them awkwardly, and clusters of tangled branches forced me to detour around thickets that looked almost deliberately placed. The air thinned as I descended through pockets of colder temperature, and the ground changed texture from soft soil to coarse, gritty dirt. The trees began to thin only after I'd fought my way down for several minutes, long enough that my shins were streaked with red and my arms were scratched from pushing through dense growth. When I finally broke through the last cluster of pines, I stumbled onto a dirt road I didn't recognize. It cut across the slope at a shallow angle, compacted and dusty, the kind of service road that might lead to old mining equipment or a maintenance area. It wasn't on my map, and the direction it ran didn't match the trails I knew. I bent forward, catching my breath, letting the quiet expand again. This time the silence felt normal, open, the kind of stillness that happens in the mountains early in the morning before the day wakes up. The strange rhythmic footsteps were gone. The forest behind me sounded natural again, Distant bird calls, faint wind, the soft tick of cooling pine needles. I followed the dirt road slowly, staying alert for anything familiar. After about 15 minutes, it curved around a ridge and connected to a wider gravel road I recognized from a previous trip. From there, it took another 20 minutes to reach the trailhead where my car waited in the morning light. The relief I felt wasn't dramatic. It was more like a deep exhale that loosened a tightness I hadn't realized I was holding. Later that day, when the adrenaline wore off, I tried to retrace the route using the GPX file, but the loops didn't correspond to any mapped trail. I checked topographic maps, satellite views, even scanned for unofficial paths, but nothing matched the pattern my phone had drawn. I kept telling myself it was a combination of GPS drift, shadows, ravines, and my own early morning disorientation. All of those things can happen in dense forests, especially in mountain regions where signals bounce unpredictably. But when I replayed the run in my head, the sound of those footsteps always returned with perfect clarity. Same weight, same tempo, same cadence as mine. For weeks, that echo stayed with me, like something I had accidentally overlapped in a place where it didn't belong. I joined the group hike late in September of 2022, a time when the highlands were already slipping toward early autumn darkness. The bothy we were headed to sat a little way off the main trails near Glencoe, a squat stone building with soot stains above the chimney and a door that stuck at the bottom. The hike up had been muddy but not difficult, a slow push through damp air, the mountains looming as dim silhouettes by the time we reached the valley floor below the ridge. There were 7 of us altogether, most of them regulars who knew the area well. I had only been on one shorter outing with them before. I tried to keep close to whoever was nearest as the light dimmed, partly out of politeness, partly from the simple fact that visibility dropped faster than I expected once the sun dipped behind the ridge. By the time we reached the bothy, the ground was soft with moisture, and a thin, grainy mist drifted down from the higher slopes. Inside, the place was exactly what I had been told. A single room with wooden bunks along one wall, a rough table, and a small stove that gave off far more smoke than heat. People sorted their sleeping gear, cooked simple meals, and talked quietly until one by one they settled down. By 10, the only sounds were the occasional shift of fabric, the crackle from the stove, and the faint scrape of wind brushing the edges of the stone walls. I stayed awake longer than the others, partly because I was new and didn't feel tired yet, partly because I always need time to unwind before sleeping in a place I don't know. The bothy felt safe enough, though the darkness pressing at the single small window made me oddly aware of how far we were from anything like streetlights or houses. When I stepped outside around 10:15 to pee, the air felt colder than before, with that brittle kind of chill that forms right before the temperature fully drops for the night. Mist skimmed the ground in slow drifts, thinning in patches and thickening in others as if drawn by invisible threads. Even with the moon hidden, I could see the faint line of the path we had walked up on. It looked like a pale seam stitched across the moor. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I waited for that familiar moment when the outlines of things become clear enough to feel solid again. I stood there, just breathing in air that smelled of wet soil and cold stone, when something moved out in the fog. It was a small, warm-looking dot of color, swinging gently. At first it looked like the sort of lantern campers sometimes use, the kind that casts a soft yellow glow. It hovered low, maybe waist height from where I saw it, drifting as though someone was walking with it. My first thought was that another hiker had arrived late and gotten turned around, which wasn't unusual for these open moor areas, especially with mist settling in. I raised my head slightly and tried to call out with a tone that was meant to carry, but not alarm. The sound came out thin in the damp air. The moment I made the noise, the light paused. It didn't flicker or dip, it simply stopped moving, as if whoever held it had frozen in place. Then it shifted direction and started coming toward me. What struck me first was the smoothness of the movement. It didn't bounce with the rhythm of footsteps the way a handheld lantern should. It glided, keeping a steady line and pace that made my skin pinch with a sudden, uninvited thought that something about the situation wasn't adding up. I squinted, trying to see the shape of the person carrying it, but the mist was too thick. The light brightened as it approached, but nothing around it brightened with it. The rocks on the ground stayed dark. The grass didn't pick up even a faint band of yellow. The light glowed only on itself, a compact knot of color suspended in its own small world. It closed the distance quickly, stopping about 10 meters away. The height put it roughly at my chest level. The silence around me sharpened. Even the weak wind felt like it had stepped back. I stared at the thing, trying to make sense of it. It seemed to hang in place, swaying in tiny, steady arcs. Not random ones, but measured ones, like a pendulum with no visible string. As I watched it, something inside the bothy clicked. It was a sharp, hard sound, almost like a piece of metal tapping against stone, except thinner. I turned my head slightly, only enough to flick my eyes toward the dark doorway behind me. The stove made small settling noises, but this had come from higher, near the bunks. The air shifted behind me, a brief pressure change that made me instinctively glance back again. I didn't see any of the hikers move. Their sleeping bags were still, their shapes dark lumps against the shadows. But in that instant, right behind me, just inside the doorway I had left open, a whisper cut through the stale air. It was harsh and unsteady, the kind of sound made by breath forced through a narrow space rather than by a clear voice. It told me to shut the door. I felt something cold slide up the back of my neck, not from the air, but from the shock of hearing anything at all in that stillness. I turned fully, expecting to see someone awake, but everyone lay exactly as before. No shifting, no signs of someone rolling back down after speaking. My mind tried to find a rational thread, maybe someone half asleep mumbling, maybe the wind slipping through a gap in the stone, but the timing of it, the direction of it, and the closeness of it left me rattled. When I turned back toward the moor, the glowing light was gone. At first I thought it had moved so that I simply couldn't see it through the mist, but then I noticed the fog ahead of me churning in a slow, circular pattern. Not fast, not violent, just a steady curling motion, like mist being stirred from underneath. That unease that had been pricking at me deepened into something heavier. I could feel my pulse thudding in my arms. Whatever had been out there, or whoever, was no longer visible, but something had clearly disturbed the air in a way I couldn't explain. I backed up one step, then another. The threshold of the bothy felt too far away, even though I had only taken a few steps outside. When I reached the door, I pulled it closed and pushed the bolt across with more force than needed. The scrape of metal sounded too loud in the small space. I stood there for a moment, letting my breathing settle. No one else stirred. The only sound was the faint hiss of the wind outside, and the occasional pop from the stove as a piece of wood shifted. Eventually I crawled into my sleeping bag, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that light hovering motionless above the ground, untouched by the world around it. I didn't hear anything else the rest of the night, no footsteps, no knocks, no more sounds from the door. Just the steady hum of my own nerves refusing to calm down. In the morning, the mist had thinned to a light veil, and the sky held that pale, washed-out color that comes after a cold night. I kept scanning the moor as we packed up, half expecting to see something out of place. The older Scottish hiker, the one who had led the group up the trail, noticed the way my eyes kept darting toward the path. He mentioned casually, while tightening the straps on his pack, that people sometimes saw strange lights in the area when fog pooled in the valleys. He explained how pockets of gas near the peat bogs could reflect distant light and create the illusion of floating lanterns. He talked about how moisture in the air bends light in odd ways, making distant headlamps or reflections seem closer or suspended. He had seen similar phenomena himself over the years. The more he talked, the more I realized that what I had witnessed didn't need anything supernatural to feel unsettling. A drifting light, a shifting patch of mist, the echo of a sound carried in a stone room where noise doesn't behave the way you expect. None of it was impossible. The harsh whisper could have been a mix of wind pushing through a narrow crack near the door and the stove drawing air unevenly, warped by the acoustics of the space. The sound had startled me at the worst possible moment, right when my attention was swallowed by something I couldn't explain yet. By the time we packed up to hike back down, I still felt uneasy, but the rational explanations settled into place. The experience hadn't been supernatural. It had been a mix of timing, weather, visibility, and nerves sharpened by darkness in unfamiliar terrain. The highlands have countless pockets where mist, light, and sound behave strangely. I had walked straight into one of them at the exact wrong moment. And even though the older hiker's explanation eased the worst of my fear, the memory stayed with me. Proof of how easily the mind can twist ordinary natural phenomena into something menacing when the world narrows to mist, cold, and silence. I spent most of February 2016 alone behind the front desk of a tiny mountain motel off Highway 395, just south of Lone Pine. The place had 14 rooms, 2 vending machines that barely worked, and a heater in the lobby that rattled so loudly it drowned out the sound of the storm whenever winter hit hard enough. That month had been nothing but storms. The passes into the Sierra Nevada kept closing every few days, trapping whoever happened to be traveling through. Most nights, the motel stayed empty except for 1 or 2 stranded drivers who came in with windburned faces and asked if the ice on the highway was really as bad as it looked. I always gave them the same answer. It was usually worse. The night everything happened was a Tuesday, and the storm had rolled in around dusk, thick enough that the mountains behind the motel disappeared into a white blur. By midnight, the wind had picked up so hard that the office windows shuddered in their frames. The satellite TV signal blinked in and out, leaving the quiet broken only by gusts and the popping of the baseboard heater. I kept going out to the walkway every half hour to knock loose the ice that gathered around the doors, just trying to make sure the few guests we had could get out if they needed to. There was no one else working that shift. The owner lived 30 minutes away and didn't drive up during storms unless the power went out completely. Only 3 rooms were rented that night. Room 3 held a trucker who had parked his rig as close to the building as he could get, its headlights barely visible through the swirling snow. Room 11 had a couple who had come up from Ridgecrest and regretted it the moment they hit black ice near Independence. And Room 7 held a single man who had checked in around 10, wearing a thin jacket and carrying a backpack soaked from the slush. He looked relieved just to be out of the wind. I gave him extra towels to block the draft under the door. He didn't speak much, just nodded, and went straight to his room. Around 1:20 a.m., the phone on the desk rang. I jumped because it almost never rang that late. When I answered, all I heard at first was breathing, tight, quick. Then the caller said he was in room 7, and that someone was standing outside his window. He spoke quietly, almost like he was trying not to draw attention. He didn't explain what he meant, and I didn't ask. Out here, sometimes people saw things that turned out to be nothing more than shadows or branches blown sideways. But something in the way he breathed made me put on my jacket without thinking. I grabbed the big flashlight we kept under the desk. The beam was strong enough to cut through most kinds of weather, and I'd used it more than once to check on broken heaters, blown fuses, or animals digging around the dumpsters. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me so sharply it felt like the air had teeth. Snow blew in sheets across the parking lot, the kind that didn't fall straight down but moved sideways, getting into every opening in your clothes. The walkway was coated in a brittle layer of ice that cracked under my boots. Room 7 sat near the middle of the row, facing the slope that rose straight up toward Mount Whitney. That side of the property always felt different at night, as if the mountain pressed against it. No other buildings, no lights, nothing but rock and snow climbing into darkness. I reached the door and knocked. The man opened it just a couple of inches. His face was pale, his eyebrows dusted with condensation from the room's heater, and he kept glancing toward the window that looked out at the slope. He pointed at the glass with a shaking hand. The window was fogged from the inside, but in the center was a smudge where someone had wiped it clear with either a hand or sleeve. He didn't say anything else, and I didn't try to get him to. I stepped back out, swung the flashlight toward the slope, and tried to scan the ground. The wind made the beam waver. The snow drifted so thickly that the light only reached about 20 or 30 feet before dissolving into white. I edged farther away from the building to get a better angle. That was when I saw something move. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a slight shifting on a narrow ledge about 30 feet up the slope. At first I thought it was a dark patch of rock or a small tree bent by the wind. But as I steadied the beam, I realized the shape was vertical, thin, and taller than it should have been for anything natural there. It stood at the edge of a strip of gravel exposed by the wind. The outline didn't sway or crouch. It didn't step back from the light. It just stood there, facing down toward the motel. For a few seconds I tried to convince myself it was a person, maybe someone from the road who had gotten turned around in the storm. But the slope above the motel was steep enough that even hikers with poles and crampons kept their distance when it iced over. Standing on that ledge in those conditions made no sense. I tried calling out, but the wind caught the words and tore them apart before they reached more than a few feet. My throat stung from the cold as I tried again, louder, but the reaction was the same. Nothing. No movement from the shape on the ledge. No wave. No sign it heard me at all. I blinked hard because the snow was stinging my eyes. When I looked again, the figure was gone. Not moved, not hidden, just gone, as if it had stepped sideways off the ledge into nothing. I swept the flashlight across the slope again, slow and careful. All I saw were disturbed patches where the wind had cut through the snow. Then, as I angled the light a little higher, I noticed a faint trail carved into the slope. Not leading up or down, but moving laterally across the mountain in a line that made no sense. A person climbing would go up or down. This tracked sideways along terrain that should have required gear, footholds, something. Yet the trail was there, uneven depressions in the snow, spaced like footprints. The man in room 7 didn't open the door again when I walked past. I didn't blame him. I went back to the office because the wind was getting worse, and I needed to warm my hands, which had gone numb from holding the flashlight. I spent the next few hours sitting stiffly behind the desk, listening to the storm hammer the windows, checking the walkway again and again from the security monitor. The cameras didn't catch anything unusual, just streaks of snow whipping past the lenses. But every time the heater clicked, every time the roof groaned under a gust, I felt the same crawling suspicion that the man in room 7 must have felt before he called. The storm eased around dawn. Everything outside looked buried under a fresh layer of white that softened the motel into something almost peaceful. I walked the length of the building to clear the steps, and that was when I saw the prints. They were half filled by the night's new snow, but the pattern was still clear. The trail from the mountain slope curved down behind room 7, then continued along the back of the building. Not toward the parking lot, not toward the road, but straight along the windows. The marks drifted close to the glass of each room in turn, as if someone had been standing directly outside, leaning in, checking for something. The track moved from 7 to 8, then to 9 and 10, pausing at each window before continuing. The prints stopped behind room 11, fading into an area where the wind had smoothed everything clean. I followed them as far as I could, but they simply vanished where the snow had piled up overnight. No trail leading away toward the woods. No sign of where the person had gone. Just the quiet hiss of the wind and the strange line of half-buried footsteps that traced the back of the motel like someone making rounds. When the guests checked out later that morning, no one mentioned anything unusual. The man from room 7 avoided my eyes as he handed back the key, his backpack slung tight against his shoulders. He left without a word. I didn't blame him for that either. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The only explanation that fit was the one I least wanted to believe. Someone had been moving along that mountain in the middle of the storm, someone comfortable enough on the ice to cross places no normal traveler would dare. Maybe a climber who knew the terrain better than any of us. Maybe someone who lived out there, hidden from sight. Someone who knew the motel lights stayed on through all kinds of weather. Someone who watched the rooms from above and used storms as cover to move closer without being seen. I never found out who it was, but every winter after that, when the storms rolled in and the mountains disappeared behind white walls of wind, I kept the curtains in the office closed. And whenever someone checked into room 7, I handed them the key with a quiet reminder to keep their window covered at night, especially when the weather got bad. Not because I wanted to scare them, but because I knew that once someone had walked that impossible line across the slope, they could do it again. I took the seasonal job in Hakuba Valley because I wanted something quiet after a chaotic stretch back home. The ski lodge wasn't large, just a modest place tucked between taller hotels, its wood siding stained dark from decades of storms. Most of the winter staff lived in a squat dorm building attached to the back of the lodge by a short covered walkway. I slept in a narrow room on the second floor, barely wide enough for a bed and a metal rack for my clothes. The walls had almost no insulation, so I could hear the wind press against the siding at night, a long, steady pressure like something testing the building's strength. In January 2023, storms rolled through almost every other day. At night, the world outside turned absolutely silent, the falling snow swallowing every bit of sound. I grew used to that silence, but I never became fully comfortable with it. There's something about being awake after midnight in a place where no one else is moving that makes every small task feel heavier and more personal, as if you've stepped outside of the world other people occupy. My shift that week required me to check the emergency exit paths around the lodge. The management wanted clear runoff routes in case a power failure forced everyone outside. The back exit was the hardest because it opened directly onto a narrow access lane cut into a sloping hillside. To the right, the hill rose into dense cedar and birch forest. To the left, it dropped sharply toward a frozen service road. Snow built up unevenly along the edge, drifting into strange shapes. You learned quickly not to trust your depth perception. That night, around 2 in the morning, the snowfall was thick enough that my headlamp beam looked like it was shining through a shaken snow globe. The flakes were heavy and wet, piling fast. When I stepped outside, the cold slapped against my neck where my scarf had slipped. I bent down to push the door closed behind me, so the wind wouldn't drive snow into the hallway. For a moment, I just stood still and listened. Nothing moved except the faint hiss of falling snow. I started shoveling the narrow path that hugged the wall of the building. It was slow work. Every scoop felt like lifting wet cement. The beam of the headlamp darted across the slope as I worked, catching flashes of tree trunks and low branches weighed down by ice. I paused now and then to rest my shoulders, letting the shovel hang loosely from my hands while I breathed into the scarf. It was during one of those pauses that the light caught something at the line where the forest met the shoveled path. At first, I thought the snow had formed some strange indentation. Maybe a branch had fallen earlier and been buried. But the shape was too clear. 5-finger marks, spread wide, pressed deep into the snow. A full handprint, bare skin to snow. The fingers angled upward toward the slope, as if someone had been pushing themselves up the incline. I crouched without thinking, brushing a glove across the edge of it. The print was sharp. The snow around it hadn't had time to soften or fill. I felt a twist in my stomach as I realized it couldn't be more than an hour old, probably even newer. And it wasn't alone. Just past it, maybe half a meter upslope, was another. Then another. A broken trail of them, each set staggered slightly, like someone losing their balance and scrambling forward. I stood, trying to reason it out. Maybe someone had come down the slope earlier that evening, slipped, and tried to crawl back up. But there were no footprints, no boot treads, no slide marks from legs or knees. Only hands, spaced irregularly, each pressed deep, sometimes overlapping, sometimes angled as if the person kept shifting direction. I told myself I should go back inside, finish the other exits, and report the prints to the manager in the morning. That would have been the smart thing. But standing there in the quiet, with nothing but the snow falling hard around me, I felt a pull to understand what I was looking at. It didn't feel right to walk away without knowing how far the prints went. I followed them upslope, stepping carefully so I wouldn't disturb anything. The grade was steeper than it looked from below. After only a few meters, my boots sank almost to my ankles. The trees grew closer overhead, and the headlamp beam caught clusters of needles and branches weighed heavy with snow. The handprints climbed in a rough line, sometimes close together, sometimes spaced far apart, as if whoever made them had struggled with uneven footing. They went on for maybe 10 meters before I stopped. The sensible part of my mind finally pushed through the curiosity. I was alone, halfway up a dark slope in heavy snowfall, with no radio on me. If I twisted an ankle up there, no one would find me until morning. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a low, wet dragging sound from somewhere above me. It wasn't loud. If anything, the snow seemed to muffle it even more, but it was close enough that my body reacted before my brain did. I straightened sharply, breath caught in my throat. The sound didn't repeat. The silence returned, thicker than before. I raised my headlamp slowly, angling the beam into the tight weave of trees higher on the slope. The light caught the continuation of the handprints, leading up to a dark shape pressed against the trunk of a cedar. The figure looked like someone kneeling, head bowed forward, hair or fabric hanging down, arms braced into the snow. I couldn't make out details, just the outline and the unnatural stillness. I took one shaky step back. The beam flickered, likely from the cold, a brief dimming that lasted no more than a second. When it steadied, the shape was gone. Not moved gone. No shift of snow, no blur of motion, no sign that anything had been there at all. But the handprints continued upward past where the figure had seemed to be, fresh and sharply defined in the beam. My chest tightened in a way that felt physical, like something squeezing around my ribs. I no longer cared about understanding what I was seeing. I wanted to be back inside with walls around me. I turned and half slid, half walked down the slope, letting gravity pull me until I reached the path. I didn't look back at the tree line. When I reached the bottom, I noticed something I had missed before. The handprints didn't stop at the forest's edge. They continued down the slope, across the narrow access lane, and straight to the lodge's foundation wall. The final prints were pressed deep into the packed snow right below the staff dorm windows. My window was the second from the left. I scanned the building's side, hoping for some sign that made the prints less alarming. A ladder, a broken pipe, animal tracks mixed in. Nothing. Just the marks of bare hands, leading straight to the place where we slept. By morning, heavy snowfall had erased everything. When I tried to explain to the manager what I'd seen, I realized how unbelievable it sounded. Handprints with no footprints, a shape that vanished, a trail leading directly to our windows. I left out most of it. I said only that I thought someone had tried to climb the slope during the night and that we should check the security cameras. The cameras behind the lodge were old and positioned badly. The one that faced the dorm windows recorded only a blurred rectangle of blowing snow from midnight to dawn. Nothing visible, nothing helpful. A few days later, during a rare clear afternoon, I walked the slope again. Without snow falling, I could see details I hadn't before. Small sections of disturbed bark on trees. Scratches on low branches where someone might have grabbed for balance. A faint impression in the soil beneath the snow where someone might have slipped repeatedly. There was nothing supernatural or unexplainable about it, just a steep, icy hillside where a desperate or injured person could have crawled upward using only their hands. The explanation didn't comfort me. It made the prints feel more real, more human, and far more unsettling. Whoever had made them had climbed straight to our dorm windows in the middle of a storm, leaving no sign of boots, no sign of turning back, and no sign of walking away. I finished out the season because breaking my contract felt like admitting that one night had gotten under my skin. But I never volunteered for late-night checks again. And even now, when I think back on that slope, the detail that stays with me isn't the shape against the tree or the dragging sound above me. It's the final set of handprints, pressed deep into the snow beneath my window, perfectly centered as if the person had paused there for a long time, steadying themselves against the wall while the storm buried every other trace of their presence.